And I want to start by thanking the Canadian Embassy here for organizing this, and also the museum. I had a wonderful tour of the museum, which has some wonderful pieces from North America and the North American Arctic, and some from British Columbia, which made me a little homesick. I also want to thank you for coming today, and for your introduction and making some of my talk easier. As Alicia said, I actually have never been to the Nunavut part of the Canadian Arctic, so if you have questions on that, you should ask her and not me. And I apologize for not being able to speak in Spanish today. The head of the Arctic Council for the Swedish chairmanship recently said, "The Arctic is hot." And he wasn't actually talking about the temperature. He was talking about the incredibly increased interest in the Arctic. And as many of you know, the Swedish chairmanship of the Arctic Council is ending soon in the middle of May, and Canada will be taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. And the head will be Leona Aglukak, who's actually an Inuit woman, our current Minister of Health. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to once again lead the Arctic Council. And I think this is a very exciting time in terms of the Arctic as a whole, but especially in terms of of Canada's involvement. And as you said, the Arctic is a big part of both the Canadian geography and the Canadian identity. I also just wanted to say that when I talk about the Arctic today, I'm really talking about the Arctic and the subarctic, the circumpolar north, as it were. And as Alicia said, I'm more of an expert in the Siberian Arctic. I've been to a lot more of the Russian Arctic and subarctic than I have been to the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, which is maybe ironic. I thought I'd also just stick in a very short advertisement here. The organization that I'm president of is the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, and it's open to anyone who wants to belong. I would love to see more Spanish members, and so there's the website if you're interested. It's like I said, it's a member-driven organization. So I wanted to start with exactly what Alicia was talking about, which is this situation that climate change is critical to the Arctic. And this map here, I hope you can see it from the back. It shows the in a little orange line there, the extent of Arctic ice in 1979, and then the extent of Arctic ice this summer. And you can see there's been a vast decrease in the extent of Arctic ice. Change in the Arctic climate change in the Arctic will have a serious impact on Arctic environments and on people's lives. And it presents a lot of challenges, some of which Alicia mentioned, melting permafrost, potential greenhouse gases escaping from the permafrost, flooding, changes in the distribution of animals and plants, and that means invasive species, and these are just some of the changes. It also presents opportunities for the growth in mining and other resource extraction, for the growth in shipping, growth in tourism, things like that. What I want to argue today is that sometimes in looking at climate change in the Arctic, we also tend to forget that there are other changes going on that are also very important. And so what I call this talk is, it's about climate change, but also much more. Some Arctic residents will tell you, if you ask them, that climate change is a concern, but they've been dealing with climate change for millennia, and they're adaptable. They know how to deal with this. Others will say that the pace of change is a problem, and they haven't ever dealt with that before. But many indigenous Arctic residents will say that the rapid social and economic changes that are happening are what's really threatening to them. So I don't want anyone in this room to leave thinking that I'm saying that climate change isn't important. Climate change is very important. But my message is that we have to remember about the changes that are happening today that will affect life of the Arctic residents today, tomorrow, next week, in terms of economic, cultural, political, and social changes. And I also am, as the president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, I want to stress that a lot of these questions need to be answered by social scientists. And it's increasingly important that we include social sciences in the looking at the Arctic and dealing with these problems. Some of the changes that I think are important are under these different 5 categories: demographic change, economic change, political change, cultural change, and health and well-being. And I want to say a few words about each of these. I also want to say that this is a pretty short talk, and so I'm going to have to make some gross generalizations. The Arctic is a very diverse region. There are many contrasts socially, culturally, economically. And so I apologize for a lot of simplification, and maybe during the question period we can talk more about the diversity. So who are we talking about in the Arctic? There are about 4 million people who live in the Arctic. Now it totally obviously depends on where you draw the boundary of the Arctic. So this is Arctic and a little bit of the subarctic. And we often think of indigenous peoples, and I've probably encouraged you to think about indigenous peoples by including this picture of some Avane woman in northeast Siberia. The indigenous population itself is very diverse. We have Inuit and Chukchi and Nenets and Avane and Athabascans, and there are about, there are well over 100 different peoples who live in the Arctic from the indigenous population, many, many different languages. But the indigenous population are only 8% of the Arctic population. And I think we sometimes forget that. The bulk of the Arctic population is not indigenous. Another thing we often forget is the Arctic is highly urbanized. 80% of the Arctic residents in Russia live in cities. And some of these are pretty big cities. 60% of Icelanders, who are part of the Arctic, live in the capital city of Reykjavik. So again, highly urbanized. And then, as Alicia alluded to, the rural population is very spread out, very sparse, living in very small and widely distributed villages. So these cause different issues for the urban and the rural population. Guess that C went hanging there. Some of the demographic changes that affect the Arctic. Through much of the Arctic, we're seeing a population loss. And so from this map, what you see is the red areas and pink areas are areas that are losing population in the Arctic, and the areas of blue are the ones that are gaining them. The funny little dots in the Canadian part of the Arctic are due to the way we collect statistics for settled points versus districts or larger areas. But this shows you that there are a lot of areas of loss of population. Birth rates among Arctic residents are fairly low, a little bit lower among the non-indigenous than the indigenous population, but relatively low. Mortality rates are higher on average for the Arctic residents than non-Arctic parts of these populations of these same countries. But the main influence is outmigration. And what we see is sometimes referred to the hollowing out of the population, especially from rural areas. Young adults are migrating out, and sometimes leaving their children even behind. What we're losing are the most ambitious and most skilled people. Now, some of this is due to push factors, the decline of local resources such as fish stocks, or the decline of services. In the Russian north, we had a crash in services during the late 1990s. But a lot of it has to do with pull factors. One has to leave the Arctic in many cases to receive education or jobs. I should say that this trend has reversed in a few areas in recent times. There are more people going back to the Norwegian north and the Fennoscandian north, as you can see from a little bit of blue there. The red sort of predominates, but in most parts we see a domination of pink and red. Urbanization, as I said, is increasing in the Arctic as elsewhere in the world. And again, this is a map which shows areas that are increasing in population in urban centers and other areas where urban or villages are decreasing. And so what we see is in most places the urban populations are increasing. Only again in Russia there's some decrease in the urban population. The pace is different, but the trend is the same across the Arctic. And this is a trend for both the indigenous and the non-indigenous part of the population. 10% of Canadian Inuit live in southern urban areas. There's a joke that the largest Sami community in Finland lives in Helsinki, and the largest Sami community in Sweden lives in Stockholm. 7,000 Greenlanders live in Denmark, most of them in Copenhagen. The population of Greenland is 55,000 people, so 7,000 is a pretty large percentage of that. That's 13% of the total population. Urbanization means changes in lifestyle, increasingly diversified economy, better services in education, better services in childcare, more diverse cultural activities, more diverse social relations. Urbanization has a gender dimension. Women are leaving rural places at a much greater rate than men are. This is because men tend to stay more in the traditional economic sectors, and women are leaving to pursue formal education and the jobs that they can have from that formal education. And this has a negative effect on rural areas and the rural economy. It affects family structure. It's very hard for reindeer herders in the northern part of Siberia to find wives these days. It affects public services. It affects the volunteer sector, as women tend to predominate in the volunteer sector. There are a few areas, like I mentioned, where this is changing, but it is, for the most part, a trend throughout the Nordic. Then we have another really interesting trend where groups are coming into the Arctic who previously weren't seen in the Arctic, as global migration increases around the world. Immigrants from Thailand are coming into Fennoscandia as berry pickers. They're coming into Alaska as fish processors. Immigrants from Eastern Europe are coming into some of the mining areas of the Arctic. It's predicted that industrial resource development in Greenland may attract up to 2,500 Chinese in the very near future. And again, 2,500 seems like a fairly small number until you think of a population of 55,000. 5% of the Greenland population could be Chinese residents soon. Okay, a little bit on the Arctic economy. I think we can split the Arctic economy into three different sectors. You've got the international resource economy, oil, gas, minerals, fisheries, forestry, and these areas are indicated on the map, some of the main centers. I think we sometimes forget about the role that the transfer economy plays. This is the money that the capitals send north, Ottawa and Washington, D.C., and Moscow, and Helsinki and Oslo are sending north to support the north. And that is a big part of the northern economy. And then finally, the traditional economy of local resource extraction, fishing, reindeer husbandry, hunting, those kinds of things. And these activities occupy the same space, but they often aren't very well connected. They are connected a little. A woman working in an office in the transfer economy has a little bit more money perhaps to invest in a snowmobile or an ammunition to spend her weekends out on the land hunting. So these things are to give her husband the money to spend out on the land. These activities are also highly sensitive to outside forces. So there's a lot of boom and bust, especially in the international resource economy. and also in the transfer economy. And it has a lot to do with political interventions can change things quite quickly. I wanted to mention a few other changes that are happening in the Arctic economy that we often don't think about. And these are commoditization and privatization and concentration, geographical concentration. So in terms of commoditization, we see in the Arctic the replacement of services that were formerly provided by the residents for themselves, and now they're being commoditized. Childcare used to be provided by your grandmas and your aunties. Now you end up sending your kids to a creche or a nursery school. Healthcare services. You used to have medical experts from among the native population. Now we use professional doctors. Leisure activities become more and more commoditized. Privatization, including in fishing and mining, housing services, retail services. They used to be mainly cooperative. And this is true for both North America and the Soviet North. Even reindeer herding is now being privatized in Fennoscandia and the Russian North. We see the development of small businesses, and I think it's interesting to look at Canada in the development of businesses, especially among the indigenous population. The Inuit and the First Nations in northern Canada have been more successful than the non-indigenous population in creating small businesses in some areas, partly due to treaty settlement and the capital or the money that they've received that they can then invest in airlines and stores and things like that. In terms of resource extraction, which is going to play an increasing role in the Arctic, much is concentrated, or increasingly concentrated geographically in terms of company towns. These company towns often don't really help the local economy. Workers come in and fly back out, and there's very little interaction with the local people. We're also increasingly seeing local people raising the issues about ownership to the region's natural resources. Who should own them? Who should have access to them? Who should be able to exclude others from them? Under what terms? And who should benefit from resource extraction? How should the benefits be shared between the local population and the distant shareholders of companies? And how should they be managed so that generations down the line, 2, 3, 4 generations, can also benefit from the extraction of resources that are happening today? And these are big and difficult questions. Some of the external drivers that I think we have to keep in mind are the global rise in raw materials prices, and especially because of the demand from places like China and India and other Asian countries. And also increasing accessibility makes these resources, which were formerly not economically viable, to now be economically interesting. So I want to introduce the term double exposure. What I've been talking about are globalization forces, changes around the world that are also impacting the Arctic. But then let's bring climate change back into the mix. Accessibility is going to be one of the features of climate change as the Arctic becomes more accessible for shipping and as new sources of fish move into the Arctic, and as you can get to the minerals more easily now. So all these issues have both sort of a globalization side and a climate change side. And together we can talk about double exposure. Let me just give you one example in terms of fishing. Opportunities are created, but they're not created equally. As climate warms, we'll see new fish stocks go into the area, some with great commercial value. And we'll see the benefits shifting from one group to another. Different fish operate under different licensing structures. So new groups will probably access the licenses to the new fish stocks. Capitalization is different. Fishing for cod requires different capital than fishing for, say, tuna. And different types of boats, different types of technology, all that kind of stuff. So when new fish stocks move north, different capital, different technologies, different companies will have better access to those. So an overall increase in fisheries in the Arctic may mask differential gains and losses in community terms. We can also anticipate that industrial fish stocks, due to the interactions of overfishing and climate change, adverse climate change, there will be crashes in the industrial fish stock. And these are going to really affect settlements that depend on fishing. I'll just give another quick example of that. Tourism, I think, is another interesting one, where we'll see an increase in cruise liners and in land tourism. And tourism can often really transform rural areas. Small communities can experience great disturbances, but also opportunities. But if you think about tourism, it requires a lot of capital to develop, especially in terms of cruise tourism. Bigger ports, more hotels. Some of this will be unaffordable to some communities. And so again, there'll be gains by some communities and losses by others. In terms of key political changes, I think we have to consider what's happening around the world as a whole and how this affects the Arctic. Gorbachev gave his famous Murmansk speech talking about the opening up of the Arctic in 1987, and we've seen a great reduction since then of military tensions in the Arctic and a great increase in operation. The Arctic Council was established in 1996. It doesn't deal with security issue. It only has an advisory capacity. But in the last year or so, it started dealing with much more sensitive issues and strong multilateral agreements on emergency response. And it's working on shipping agreements now. And so these are sensitive issues, and it's gaining traction in these areas. At the same time, we've seen other parts of the world plagued by instability. The northern sea route is partly attractive in that it will reduce the distance from the east, Seoul, Korea, Japan, China, to Europe. And I think it's the Seoul to Rotterdam decreases 40%. But as importantly, it'll help us avoid pirate-infested areas such as the Malacca Straits and the problems, the politically volatile Suez Canal. And so these are issues that are important to consider. The other thing I want to say is that in terms of political changes, the Arctic itself has been a place where some really interesting new governance regimes or structures are being developed. The Arctic Council is one, a group of 8 countries getting together and deciding to work together on many issues. Like I said, in an advisory capacity, but still with quite a bit of power. In the Arctic, new co-management structures have been developed, new impact benefit agreement structures have been developed, and I think these are things that we need to export to the rest of the world. I want to talk a little bit about some key cultural changes. Increasing accessibility to the Arctic well before major climate change and well before increased connection to the rest of the world has been happening and has created vast cultural change. This has been happening for centuries, but it's accelerated since World War II. And some of the ways that this has really been encouraged is through mandatory schooling and throughout most of the Arctic, through urbanization, and through the introduction of wage labor and incorporation of people into that. And these are all things that were imported from outside the area. And then, of course, immigration of a lot of people into the Arctic, that 92% of the Arctic population that's non-indigenous. But more recently, I think we have some really interesting changes happening. One is low-cost communication technology, mobile phones and internet. And they're increasingly available. And they allow Arctic residents to connect with each other and talking to each other. This has reduced the difference between urban and rural life. It's really helped political movements in the Arctic. the Sami Parliament, the Sami Council, the Sami getting together, the Inuit getting together across 4 different countries, and the Sami, again, across 4 different countries to politically organize. We've seen the communications improvements helping education through distance learning. It's not quite so necessary to leave the Arctic now to receive a post-secondary education. We've seen wonderful advances in telemedicine and providing medical services. However, there's also challenges to connectedness. First of all, most of the information produced on the internet, or almost all of it, is not from the Arctic. So it's coming up north, and it leads to the erosion of local languages and to some degree local cultures. It also is a source of new societal norms, including the consumerist culture that is being communicated through the mass media. The global, and let's be realistic, the highly American-driven entertainment culture exposes Arctic residents to a limited selection of lifestyles. In the late 1990s, in the early 1990s too, I worked in some very small communities in Siberia. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, the secretary to the mayor, who I might be interviewing, came in and turned the TV on. And she watched a B-rate Mexican soap opera called Los Ricos También Lloran. Or sometimes it was the C-rate American Santa Barbara. And then they would ask me questions about life in North America, assuming that what they saw on Los Ricos También Lloran was the way that all North Americans lived. I think it's the 0.1% of North Americans live that way. I guess they also thought we were very dysfunctional. But the laughable point here is that the norms and values promoted by media often challenge and devaluate local beliefs and local cultural identities. And I think they also nurture aspirations that fail to be in line with local education and local development opportunities. And this leads to cultural stress. However, I think we also have to remember that, and I'll say a few more things about cultural stress in a minute, that while cultural stress is affecting part of the population in some very serious ways, there's a lot of really interesting cultural adaptation and cultural fusion going on. I'm using here a rather trivial example. These are the, for the most part, covers of different CD albums. Communication technologies have really pushed cultural gains in areas. Arctic people, like I said, are connecting more with each other. And we're seeing the flourishing of Arctic cultural industries, such as the media, using YouTube, Arctic music and film industries. Here we have Canadian Inuit Tanya Tagaq. Have any of you heard Tanya Tagaq play? It's a wonderful fusion of throat singing and electronic music. I really suggest you go on YouTube and Google her, and it's wonderful. Nuuk Posse it's called Nuuk's Posse, and it's Greenlandic rap and Greenlandic hip hop. Marie Boyne Peterson is a yoik-inspired singer from northern Norway. And so these are just some examples of the performing arts, the visual arts, the music, literature. I was recently in a Greenlandic shop in Copenhagen where there was a beautiful new cookbook, sort of a Jamie Oliver type of cookbook, but it was Greenlandic recipes in Greenlandic and Danish for some very high cuisine. The Arctic is also at the forefront of educational initiatives, especially in terms of distance education and bilingual education. And I think we can't forget to celebrate the creativity and the accommodation of change that we see in Arctic, where new cultural forms are being produced that enrich both the Arctic and beyond. Sometimes we forget to tell the success stories of the Arctic. Okay, finally, I want to say a few words on the health and well-being in the Arctic. Health services in the Arctic have vastly improved over the last century. The availability of advanced medical services, either in place or by telemedicine, have grown dramatically. Stable food supplies reach most areas and have eliminated starvation. And Arctic residents have a much wider variety of food goods and other goods, though at very high costs, as you probably saw in the areas. Life expectancy has dramatically improved in the last half century. Unfortunately, Russia is an exception to this, where the life expectancy of the Arctic male is less than the retirement age, and the life expectancy of the indigenous male in the Arctic is only 35 years. Throughout the Arctic, however, we see the increase of tuberculosis, we see the rise of HIV and AIDS, and we see the rise of other contagious diseases. We also see the rise of obesity and diabetes and other cardiovascular diseases due to changes in diet and lifestyle. Diet is compromised by the high cost of imported goods, so there's a lot of junk food that's being eaten, but also the fact that local country foods are being polluted by PCBs and DDT and other pollutants. And worse, we witness a devastating increase in the rates of domestic violence, child abuse, homicide, and suicide. In Nunavut, the rate of domestic violence against women is 4 times that of the Canadian average. In the Russian North, like I said, the average life expectancy for a native male is 35 years due to high rates of homicide and suicide and accidental deaths related to alcohol consumption. And Greenland tops the world in several years recently in suicide rate. So, and that's in terms of per capita. So these figures speak to a population, or at least part of the population, troubled by mental health issues, which may be attributed, at least in part, to rapid change, both cultural and economic, sort of acculturative stress. The rapid economic changes and social changes then are exacerbated by climate change. As I said at the beginning, I think some Arctic residents consider these rapid economic and social changes even more problematic, more challenging than climate change, and I think you can see why from some of the statistics I've given you. But I do want to return to the issues of climate change for a few minutes now. Climate change is a physical process, but it obviously has social roots and social consequences. In fact, the ones we really care about most are the social ones. The changing cryosphere conditions, the changes in the sea ice, cause changes in accessibility, which, as I mentioned, have both global implications for resource exploitation and local implications for subsistence hunting and reindeer herding and other local important activities. The changing biogeographic conditions, changing distribution of flora and fauna will influence Arctic residents' access to resources. This is a picture taken in Alaska of a community that has disappeared. It has had to be totally relocated because of climate change and the erosion of the edge of the land. And Arctic residents are dealing with this in a number of places. So such changes in terms of moving whole towns, whole villages, will stimulate further cultural change and further political change. I hope you can see the words there. Yeah. So what I want to say is that there's a lot of work that we have to do. We have to be able to prepare for these changes and to be able to figure out how to adapt to them. Because of them, some of them are going to happen. We would like to modify climate change, but we're already too late for some of the changes, and so we're going to need to be responding to some of them. And to do that, we have to understand a lot more of the social issues. We need to understand how individual and collective responses to environmental changes happen, and to political changes as well. We have to understand values and beliefs that different groups have about climate change. We have a whole group of people still denying climate change out there. Well, how can that be? What are the values and beliefs that inform that? But also different responses to climate change, different approaches to climate change. What are the values and beliefs behind that? We have to know a little bit more about how different groups are capable of adapting. How does this differ across space? How does it differ across different ethnic groups? How does it differ by gender and age? And so all these are social science issues that have received relatively little attention. Now, I think it's worth mentioning some of the achievements. We just finished celebrating the International Polar Year, which was 2007-2008, but sort of dripped on into 2012. The previous International Polar Years, a century ago and a half a century ago, had absolutely no social sciences in them. There was also an International Geophysical Union year in 57, which had no social sciences. In the most recent International Polar Year, 20% of the projects had to do with social sciences. So I think this is very encouraging. And I think that there are places where we have made major improvements. Some of these are integrating traditional knowledge into understandings of how change, both climate and other change, will affect the Arctic. And I would say that I think we've done this well across the circumpolar north, but I'm especially proud of what Canada has contributed to this. I think we've better identified local vulnerabilities to change and potential adaptation strategies. We're doing much better than we were doing a few years ago in terms of working with communities. Communities are demanding that we work with them, and I think a lot of scientists have risen to that occasion and are learning how to work effectively and appropriately with local communities. And related to that is a recognition of the importance of indigenous knowledge and the ways of indigenous experience and ways of knowing that are very different than Western ways. It's hard to wrap one's head around this, but it's very, very important. And indigenous peoples, like I said, are demanding on this. And we're also certainly understanding more about what the past has been like and past ways of adapting, past actions, and what these can tell us about future adaptations. But I'd say there are a few places where we really need to pay a little bit more attention. This is certainly true of some of the Canadian social sciences, but I think it's true from across the circumpolar north. First of all, a lot of our real gains have been in understanding local and traditional knowledge and local and traditional systems. Anthropologists and cultural geographers, at least, really like to get out and work with indigenous people. There's a joke that says the average Sami family up in Norway or Finland includes a mother, a father, 2 children, a reindeer, and an anthropologist. The anthropologists like going to visit the Sami or the Inuit or the Chukchi. 92% of the population is non-indigenous, and we're not studying that population. These include 4th or 5th generation families who've been in the north for a long time, sometimes 7 generations up in the Russian north. It includes folks who went up after or since World War II because of high wages. They didn't plan to stay, but they were lured to the north. They fell in love with the north, and they now consider it home. And it includes immigrants from different parts of the world that have previously been much present in the north, who are now contributing increased numbers, and who are providing new sources of migrants with different cultural values, with different things to offer the north. The best restaurant in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, is the Thai restaurant, and I'd recommend any of you getting to Nuuk to try it. We need anthropologists, economists, geographers, political scientists, sociologists to spend time understanding the motives and the aspirations and decisions of these groups. We also tend to go into the north and ask people about the local situation. And I would say we're a little bit guilty of parochialism. So a favorite thing of anthropologists is to go and ask the Inuit about snow and ice and seals and polar bears. And the Inuit know an awful lot about snow and ice and seals and polar bears. But the Inuit have opinions about urbanization and industrial development and shipping and in-migration and out-migration and the loss of women from their communities. And these are all very important issues that I think we need to spend more time on. And so that would be a challenge. And I think we need to not only spend more time, but our national governments need to consider these as important topics to fund for research. So finally, I just want to say a few things about what social science is contributing and can contribute. Change, as I hope you've gathered from the talk, is complex. There are multiple factors. There are synergistic factors. And there's a lot of stuff to understand, and we need to really be working on that. We're doing a much better job, and I think there's a lot more to do. We can do this through multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. And I think the Arctic has been a very fruitful place to start that work in the last, I'd say, 20 years. We're developing ways to measure and track human development in the Arctic. And this is really important. We have to know what is happening up there. I've been involved in a project called the Arctic Social Indicators Project. And essentially it's taking the United Nations Human Development Index type of indicators and adapting them to the Arctic and adding new ones in for the Arctic. The Arctic Human Development Report number 1, which was published in 2004 and is available online, said that there are 3 things that are important to Arctic residents: contact with nature, the cultural viability, and the ability to control one's own destiny. These are things that are specifically important that Arctic residents talk about again and again. So in measuring human development, we need to measure the material well-being, we need to measure the health, we need to measure the educational level, that kind of well-being, but we also have to measure fate control over one's destiny, cultural well-being, and this closeness to nature. And we've just developed a set of indicators for that, which we hope to use to track development in the North. The Arctic Human Development Report itself, we're working on report number 2, which will come out in 2014. And I think the other thing is that we can continue to work on improving the co-production of knowledge with Arctic residents, indigenous and non-indigenous local residents, across a whole range of topics. We need to continue to build partnerships with natural scientists. I don't know if Francisco, you're still here. We're working together on some of this quite well through different organizations. Francisco Navarro and I are both on a couple of on the International Arctic Science Committee, which has different groups, and so I think this is a way of encouraging integration into of research on natural and social sides on adaptation and resilience. And then I think another important thing is to make sure that the science we're producing, whether it's social science or natural science, is accessible to decision makers, to policy bodies, and to Arctic residents. So I wanted to bring 2 resources to your attention, and one is this Arctic Human Development Report. And like I said, it's available from downloading on the web. If you Google it, you can get the whole thing or any chapters. There's another very interesting book with the title of Megatrends. Doesn't sound like anything necessarily having to do with Arctic, but it is about Arctic change, and it's just recently come out. And as I said, the Arctic Human Development Report will be coming out in 2014. I'm a co-lead on this project, and if any of you are interested in this and would be interested in reviewing chapters before it comes out, I would love to know about it. So I think that concludes my comments. I'd like to say again thank you to the Canadian International Centre for the Arctic, which has arranged these talks to the Canadian embassies, and the maps were from that Megatrends book. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Fondahl, for such an interesting talk. Ahora tenemos tiempo para algunas preguntas. Puede ser en inglés o en español porque lo pueden traducir. ¿Quién quiere preguntar algo? El primero he visto ahí al fondo. Usted es el segundo. Sí, usted.
Thank you, Ms. Fondahl, for the speech. It was very interesting. I wanted to address two specific questions regarding assurance, especially in the Russian part. I heard former President Gail call for increased migration towards the north. They needed to populate the north. I think he mentioned that 1 or 2 years ago. Is there any specific policy being established to prevent that migration to the north? And second question is, how do you see China's role in future developments of the Arctic? Thank you.
Antes de contestar me piden que se presenten. Preséntese aunque sea al final, por favor.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel in Spanish Air Force and working currently as a Ministry of Defense.
Gracias, thank you.
Okay, well, in terms of increased migration into the Russian north, as many of you probably know, there was a huge outflux in the 1990s, starting in about 1991, and a very large part of the population left the north, the non-indigenous population flowing out of the Russian north. There were two different reasons for this. Right as the Soviet Union broke up, a number of peoples from the former Soviet republics left. So Ukrainians went back home to Ukraine, or Belarusians went back to Belarusia. And some of that reversed, so that by 1994 or 1995, at least some of the Ukrainians and Belarusians and Moldovans started to come back to the north. But there was also a big outflow because of the termination of services to the north. So that whereas during the Soviet period, a lot of northern communities had been subsidized and very well supported with foodstuffs and medical supplies and teachers and doctors and all that, that was not the case in the mid to late 1990s. And when those services were lost, people who could afford to leave often did so. There, of course, is a concern about not having enough people in the north in Russia. Some North Americans have written that there's still too many people in Russia. There's a book out, The Siberian Curse. But there is an interest, and I think there's an interest probably in obviously this isn't an issue that's spread across the north, but some of the industrial centers need more people for resource development. And so there's policies being developed both at the federal level, but also often at the, I don't really want to say regional level, not local level, but regional level, to attract workers into the oil fields and the mining sector and all that. And it's an interesting situation of the tension. Russia has also increasingly seems to be interested in shift workers for some of the resource development and using that model of the 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out, or whatever the period is, so that it's not building up some of the sources. So there is a tension there between different camps, if you want. I don't think I can give anything more specific than that. I'm not good at reading these governmental documents and then remembering all the details. In terms of China's role, that's also a very interesting question and a politically loaded one. The Arctic Council is comprised of the 8 countries that border the Arctic, and then permanent participants, which are the indigenous groups. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Gwich'in International Council, the Aleut International Association, the Sami, are all represented at the table. And then there are observers. And there is increasingly an interest in more and more countries to have that observer status. And there's also an increasing interest in the observers to have greater power. Now, the observers include countries like China and South Korea and Japan, and there's a whole set of countries that already have that status and a number of countries who are trying to gain that status now. The Arctic Council is just redeveloping its criteria for observer status. And at the May meeting, the ministerial meeting, a new criteria will be voted on. So we don't really know exactly what that's going to look like right now. China has been very assertive in the last couple of years, and probably especially in the last several months, about its having rights to the resources of the North. And it certainly is putting a lot of capital into the development of icebreakers and technologies. It's asserting its presence in the North. And even with the International Arctic Science Committee, which Francisco and I are on, and also, where's Daniel? Is he still here? Yes, is on also. The Chinese are now sending delegates and making sure they're there to those meetings, and often each country has an opportunity to send 1 or 2 delegates, and I think the Chinese are more increasingly sending 2 delegates to some of the meetings. So there is a political will and the backing behind it to be seen as a major Arctic player.
In the Arctic, mostly in Kulusrak, and in Nome, in Alaska. I've been living for a while in Canada, but I didn't get in contact with the Inuits in Canada. I'm not very much acquainted with the Nenets in Russia, but I've been living for the last 10 years in Norway with the Sami. And this is one of my friends, a whale, a small one. I always consider them my sisters. And I play around with them from my kayak. And I used to play harmonica to them. I always try to communicate with these things, which are our sisters. And I took down a lot of notes as we were developing your speech. There are so many interesting questions to be developed. But according to my experience and my living with the Eskimos, the Inuits, the big question is, I noticed that the greed of the white man is overwhelming for those lands. And my particular question is, how is Canada dealing in the near future with the greedy of the white man? Because as far as I can see, it's nothing but greediness up in the Arctic. In a very short time, very, very short time, it will be ice-free in the Arctic lands. And I noticed nothing but the white man killing the land. Killing the land. We are building huge airports. We are building big ports, only for the mining industry. Only for the greedy of the white man. How is Canada in this near future trying to deal with this emptiness that will overcome in this near future? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Wow, that's a big one to answer, and I have to agree that there's a lot of negative trends that are going on, and I don't know if we can talk about Canada, because we have the government of Canada, and we have the government of the Northwest Territories, and the government of Nunavut, and the government of Yukon, and then we have local governments and all that. in chairing the Arctic Council, Canada has put forward 3 areas of focus, and one of them is sustainable northern communities. And I think that what's becoming evident is the future chair of the Arctic Council, Leona Glukak, she has made it very clear that she feels that the humans are the really critical part of the Arctic. But again, that's an advisory body. That isn't the Canadian government, and she has to convince us, our Prime Minister, of that. There are some very negative trends, like you say, as in terms of resource extraction not really being done for the future, or for the local residents and their futures. I do think there are 2 things I'd say. There are some very interesting developments, small scale, and they certainly don't balance out some of the larger scale, but in green energy in the Arctic, in the development of new technologies in the Arctic that will really help the population. The other thing I think it's necessary to say is I haven't worked with the Inuit in the Arctic. I work quite closely with a Athabascan group, Clasden Nation, and you know, any of Clasden Nation will admit that they want their pickup trucks and they want their big screen TV, and that they don't want to be stuck in something, you know, 100 years old, hunting around for moose in the forest. They certainly want to be able to continue to hunt the moose, which means that they want to be able to be out there hunting the moose, and they want the moose there to be there for hunting, or the same thing with caribou. So they want to take care of the environment so that the animals don't disappear, but they also want to be able to go out with their truck and hunt the moose with rifle, not spears. And so there is that tension too, and how do you balance those? And not only greedy white people from the, you can say greedy white men, I sort of like the man, blame it on you guys, no, but greedy white people from the south, you know, want these resources, but to some extent the Arctic residents certainly want those resources too, to make their lives, you know, more easy and livable, central heating and electricity and all that. So I think the real challenge is figure out how to do that sustainably, how to do that in ways that use renewable energy, renewable resources. I think the 21st century, the big challenge is going to be energy, and moving away from the extraction of non-renewable energies into energy resources. We're going to have to do it. Now, whether that's not going to be the second half of the 21st century or not, I don't know, but that's my own belief. I'm quite interested in this question from a totally different point of view. As I say, I teach at the University of Northern British Columbia, and the university recently went to bioenergy and has reduced its greenhouse gases 85% in doing that. When it's colder than -20, we have to burn a little natural gas to back up the bioenergy, but it can be done in the north. And obviously in the Arctic you can't be using bioenergy, but there's wind and solar and turbine and mini hydro, and so I think that's one real key issue that we're going to have to change.
¿Quería añadir algo?
Pues I wanted more to say a comment than ask a question, but first and foremost to thank you, because some of us who are interested in this room have been following the themes related to the Arctic, but perhaps more classical ones, and you've put at the forefront new ways of thinking, which will be interesting for us to follow up. Incidentally, as I'm sure people in the audience know, Spain is official observer at the Arctic Council, and therefore the testament of the interest of the people here, we noticed much more interest as well from the Spanish government. The gentleman at the back has raised, obviously, things. One of the issues that are of concern. There are issues of concern in the future of the Arctic. The Canadian perspective. I should have introduced myself. I'm Isabelle Sarah from the Canadian Embassy. We have my little group, especially Lorraine, has organized this event with you. And indeed, you've mentioned that the Minister of Health, who's also Minister for the Arctic Council, she's presently traveling in Northern Europe, in fact, from the beginning of this week until next week, to visit other countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, for the preparation of our presidency. And indeed, you've mentioned one of the three themes, and I think probably the government or people, I've heard people like you, because it seems that one of the priorities, you mentioned one of them, which is sustainable collectivities in the north, but the two other priorities that the Canadian government have for their presidency is the responsible exploitation of the Arctic resources, and of course, in terms of navigation, the safe navigation in the Arctic. So, I'm sorry it was not specifically a question, but on this, perhaps you would explain if you collaborate with the Arctic Council, or what is your relationship with them?
Sure, yeah, that's I'm glad you brought up the other two themes, because I forgot to mention all three. But IASA, the organization of which I'm president, has observer status, and so I've attend the Arctic Council meetings, and I can attend the 5 working groups. Time and finances don't necessarily allow that, so I tend to go to the Sustainable Development Working Group meetings, and I try to send other counselors of our organization to the other meetings if they happen to be. There's going to be a PAIM. I'm forgetting what that stands for now, but there's one of the other working groups is going to be meeting in Rovaniemi, and we happen to have a counselor in Rovaniemi, so he'll go to that. But I think it is incredibly important to try to track what the Arctic Council is doing, and I found the people there very receptive to the input of both the permanent participants, obviously as their key members, but of the other organizations. I just lost what else I was going to say about that, but yeah. So anyway, I'm headed up to Tromsø next week for the Sustainable Development Working Group meeting, and it's a good group to be part of. Oh, I know. I was going to say that the Sustainable Development Working Group is actually currently setting up a social, economic, and cultural specialty group because they realize that as a group of bureaucrats sitting around the table, they don't necessarily have all the answers, and so they're developing a sort of a go-to group for this. So, yeah. But there are constraints because those are just the Arctic countries, and so you don't necessarily get the views of Spain or France or as well represented. Yeah.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Por favor.
Francisco Navarro from the Technical University of Madrid, but I'm just curious about if there are differences in the birth and death rates between the indigenous population and the non-indigenous population in this Arctic region.
Yes, and I couldn't give you the figures off the top of my head. The indigenous population in Canada is the fastest growing population in Canada, and the birth rate among Inuit and among First Nations is quite a bit higher than the birth rate among non-Indigenous population in Canada, and the same is true in Alaska. I don't think the same is true for the Sami. And in Russia, the birth rate among the indigenous population is higher than among the non-indigenous population, but it's not as high as for North America. So there are fewer kids being born to indigenous folks in Siberia. Now again, that's across 40 different indigenous peoples, and there's variation among the different indigenous peoples too. But And the death rate is higher among all the indigenous peoples than the non-indigenous peoples. I think the Sami of the three Fennoscandian countries, the gap is very, very small now. The gap is a whole generation in Russia, about 35 years, 35, 45, 50, yeah, about 25 years difference. And the gap is, I think it's less than 10 years, but not a whole bunch less than 10 years in the North American North. I may be outdated a little, but I think it's about 8 years or so. So there's a gap, so about a half, a third of a generation in North America and a full generation in Russia and almost nothing in Fennoscandia now. And so, but if anyone else knows these figures better than I do, you can correct me. I teach a course on circumpolar geography, but I haven't taught it for 5 years now, so my information may be a little out of date.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Bueno, hago yo una. There's one question. Are there, how many indigenous scientists, I mean, in social science or in science, are involved in this research about them? Are there, or they are the indigenous, or there are other people going there to research about them? Are there really scientists coming from this population?
Yeah, there's an increasing number of indigenous scientists with university degrees. Unfortunately, a lot of indigenous people don't even finish high school still, and that is a problem, but we are getting an increasingly number of university graduates and masters and PhDs that are leading the research. But I think the other way they're becoming involved is as community researchers, and not necessarily with carrying a degree, but having a different type of expertise and having that expertise recognized. And so I had a project for 5 years, it was actually the better part of 10 years, but the last 5 years was with a First Nation group that was totally co-managed, where the university had 5 professors and the First Nation had 5 community experts, and we worked together on all aspects of designing the research questions, designing the methodologies. Both the graduate students and the First Nations youth went out and did the interviewing and did the analysis together. And that's becoming more common. So I think there's 2 answers. First of all, a small but steady growth in indigenous scholars in the more traditional way that we understand that, but also an increased recognition that there's a lot of expertise that we need to recognize in the communities. Yeah.
Bueno, sin más preguntas, muchas gracias por su charla, gracias a ustedes por su interés y por sus preguntas. Y hasta la próxima.
And I'd like to thank you again for coming. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. And I want to start by thanking the Canadian Embassy here for organizing this, and also the museum. I had a wonderful tour of the museum, which has some wonderful pieces from North America and the North American Arctic, and some from British Columbia, which made me a little homesick. I also want to thank you for coming today, and for your introduction and making some of my talk easier. As Alicia said, I actually have never been to the Nunavut part of the Canadian Arctic, so if you have questions on that, you should ask her and not me. And I apologize for not being able to speak in Spanish today. The head of the Arctic Council for the Swedish chairmanship recently said, "The Arctic is hot." And he wasn't actually talking about the temperature. He was talking about the incredibly increased interest in the Arctic. and other resource extraction, for the growth in shipping, growth in tourism, things like that. What I want to argue today is that sometimes in looking at climate change in the Arctic, we also tend to forget that there are other changes going on that are also very important. And so what I call this talk is, it's about climate change, but also much more. Some Arctic residents will tell you, if you ask them, that climate change is a concern, but they've been dealing with climate change for millennia, and they're adaptable. They know how to deal with this. Others will say that the pace of change is a problem, and they haven't ever dealt with that before. But many indigenous Arctic residents will say that the rapid social and economic changes that are happening are what's really threatening to them. So I don't want anyone in this room to leave thinking that I'm saying that climate change isn't important. Climate change is very important. But my message is that we have to remember about the changes that are happening today that will affect life of the Arctic residents today, tomorrow, next week, in terms of economic, cultural, social sciences association. And it's open to anyone who wants to belong. I would love to see more Spanish members. And so there's the website if you're interested. It's like I said, it's a member-driven organization. So I wanted to start with exactly what Alicia was talking about, which is this situation that climate change is critical to the Arctic. And this map here, I hope you can see it from the back. It shows the in a little orange line there, the extent of Arctic ice in 1979, and then the extent of Arctic ice this summer. And you can see there's been a vast decrease in the extent of Arctic ice. Change in the Arctic climate change in the Arctic will have a serious impact on Arctic environments and on people's lives. And it presents a lot of challenges, some of which Alicia mentioned, melting permafrost, potential greenhouse gases escaping from the permafrost, flooding, changes in the distribution of animals and plants, and that means invasive species, and these are just some of the changes. It also presents opportunities for the growth in mining and political and social changes. And I also am, as the president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, I want to stress that a lot of these questions need to be answered by social scientists. And it's increasingly important that we include social sciences in the looking at the Arctic and dealing with these problems. Some of the changes that I think are important are under these different 5 categories: demographic change, economic change, political change, cultural change, and health and well-being. And I want to say a few words about each of these. I also want to say that this is a pretty short talk, and so I'm going to have to make some gross generalizations. The Arctic is a very diverse region. There are many contrasts socially, culturally, economically. And so I apologize for a lot of simplification, and maybe during the question period we can talk more about the diversity. So who are we talking about in the Arctic? There are about 4 million people who live in the Arctic. Now it totally obviously depends on where you draw the boundary of the Arctic. As many of you know, the Swedish chairmanship of the Arctic Council is ending soon in the middle of May, and Canada will be taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. And the head will be Leona Aglukak, who's actually an Inuit woman, our current Minister of Health. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to once again lead the Arctic Council. And I think this is a very exciting time in terms of the Arctic as a whole, but especially in terms of of Canada's involvement. And as you said, the Arctic is a big part of both the Canadian geography and the Canadian identity. I also just wanted to say that When I talk about the Arctic today, I'm really talking about the Arctic and the subarctic, the circumpolar north, as it were. And as Alicia said, I'm more of an expert in the Siberian Arctic. I've been to a lot more of the Russian Arctic and subarctic than I have been to the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, which is maybe ironic. I thought I'd also just stick in a very short advertisement here. The organization that I'm president of is the International Arctic